Understanding cyber operations in Ukraine requires stepping away from one common assumption, and that is that war has not produced a single decisive capability that fundamentally altered the battlefield. Instead, what we observe is something much more complex. We're talking here about a constellation of cyber activities embedded within a much broader system of warfare. There is a really useful analogy here. There was an interview with The Economist by Ukrainian drone commander Robert Brovdy, and he describes how foreign observers often ask him the wrong question. They ask him, "What is the best drone?" And his response is simple. There is not a best drone. Drones perform different functions. Some drones conduct reconnaissance, others identify targets, others carry out strikes, and others relay communications. What matters here is not a single platform, but the constellation created when many capabilities are really coming together. So removing one element, removing one drone, and the balance shifts. Add another, and then the outcome changes again. That idea of a constellation is also the best way we can understand cyber operations in Ukraine. What we see is not one decisive cyber weapon, if we should use this term at all, but instead we see this constellation of activities. Disruption, espionage, broader surveillance, psychological pressure too through hack and leak operations, operational support, and perhaps broader intel collection. Cyber thus is not absent from the war, but it is also not dominant. It is embedded within a much larger operational system. The first observation that stands out immediately from the cyber dimension of the war in Ukraine is that Russia moved away from large, uncontrolled cyber operations towards more targeted, operational, focused disruption. To understand why this matters, it is important to recognize that Ukraine was not a new target in 2022. Long before the full-scale invasion, it had already become one of the central arenas for Russian cyber operations. Several earlier operations are important because they really help to explain both the expectations surrounding Russian cyber capabilities and, help us understand how Russian cyber operations have evolved during the war itself. One of the most significant examples was the Ukraine power grid attacks in both 2015 and 2016. And these were among the first, you can say, confirmed cyber operations to disrupt electricity distribution at some scale. They were widely attributed to Russian-linked group known as Sandworm, a GRU-related unit, and they really demonstrated something important. Not just the ability for these hackers to gain access to networks, but the ability to interact with industrial control systems. And these are often highly segmented operational environments that are not easy to penetrate and, above all, even harder to often manipulate successfully. And equally important was the preparation behind these operations. Russian operators spent months, if not years, building access, mapping networks, compromising the broader supply chain elements, and then really understanding the underlying infrastructure before the disruptive effects became visible. And this kind of preparatory work can be quite slow, not always easy, and of course often invisible or not being noticed. But it is the foundation of more advanced cyber operations. Another important example was NotPetya in 2017. This operation began by compromising a widely used Ukrainian accounting software provider, and it turned sort of trusted software update mechanisms into essentially a malware distribution channel. Once deployed, however, NotPetya spread far, far beyond Ukraine. It really propagated automatically across global networks, affecting lots of multinational companies worldwide and individuals, and it really caused billions of dollars in damages. So NotPetya reflected a different operational logic. It was this large-scale, super disruptive, self-propagating piece of malware that was extremely difficult to control once it was released. In many ways, it sort of resembles a singular high-impact cyber event. Quite dramatic in many ways, because it literally put some shipping and other things to a halt, and visible, but also extremely strategically risky for Russia. And this is important because one of the clearest observations during the full-scale invasion is that Russia largely moved away from this model. Instead of relying primarily on these large, self-propagating malware, Russia increasingly deployed more targeted and operationally constrained destructive tools, particularly known as wipers, data destruction tools. And in the opening weeks of the invasion alone, various researchers from often private sector companies identified multiple wiper families, and they go by various names like Whispergate, Hermetic Wiper, and ISAC Wiper. There are other family names as well, and these attacks targeted Ukrainian government institutions, but also financial institutions and other critical infrastructure entities. And two features stand out immediately. First, these operations generally involved limited propagation. So unlike NotPetya, the malware did not spread uncontrollably across borders and networks. The effects were much more contained, and they were much more operationally focused at the target. And then the second is that many of these tools appear to have been developed or adapted really quite quickly and rapidly. So rather than a more refined process of malware engineering or access over long periods, many seem designed for speed, flexibility, and immediate operational usage. So going back to this idea of a constellation, this distinction matters, right? Like NotPetya was much more closer to this singular event, bright, disruptive, extremely difficult to control. And then these later wipers that were used during the further invasion of Ukraine, in contrast, functioned much more as smaller, more precise nodes within this broader operational campaign. So they were easier to integrate into a more sustained pattern of activity and keep that operational tempo up. And importantly, many of these tools were technically quite simple to create. Some lacked, advanced evasion techniques. Others reused known methods or were assembled quickly from existing components. So from a purely technical perspective, many were not particularly elegant. But wartime operations really optimize for different things than software engineering competitions. Elegance here is not the primary metric. Operational speed is. Target change really quickly. So access opportunities might also exist only briefly. And it means that effects need to really align with military operations that are unfolding in real time. So under these conditions, the objective shifts from building the most sophisticated tool possible to deploying something that works right now at this given point in time. And in that sense, many of the wipers resemble what might be called good enough weapons. They were fast to build, they were very fast to deploy, and sufficient to essentially generate immediate disruption where needed. There's also a broader strategic logic behind this simplicity. Highly sophisticated malware often requires really extensive deployment, but also testing, operational coordination, and if you have access, etc., it requires maintenance and other things as well. And then once discovered, those capabilities might be what we call burned, reducing their sort of future usefulness. Simpler tools reduce these costs. They allow operators to sustain operational tempo through continuous sort of smaller scale disruptions rather than occasional large-scale cyber operations. And then this doesn't really mean that Russia lacked advanced cyber capabilities during the invasion. Far from it. Russia entered the war with you can say quite extensive operational experience. It knows how to establish access, and it definitely has demonstrated a willingness to even escalate cyber operations in peacetime. But what really changed during the full-scale invasion was how those capabilities were applied. And that shift reveals something important about the role cyber operations actually play in modern warfare.